Yeah, my early.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Bob Metzger. I'm from Shorewood, Wisconsin, and I've been a lifelong musician.
Yeah, you should sit down. Talk to Jim. If you look at the camera, it's a little awkward.
Okay.
For people
I
Start over again. I'll give you a cue. Roll.
Hi, I'm Bob Metzger, and I'm from Shorewood, Wisconsin, and I have been a lifelong musician, and I grew up listening to music. I was fascinated at an early age.
Is it still clipped on?
Still clipped.
Better?
Is it too high up?
I think it's too high.
Talk.
Hi.
Okay, I'll give you another cue. So sorry about that.
Okay.
Take 3.
Hi, I'm Bob Metzger, and I'm from Shorewood, Wisconsin. Grew up in Shorewood, Wisconsin, and I'm a lifelong musician. And my earliest recollections of music, well, I had an older sister and an older brother. My older sister was a rabid rock and roll music listener. She loved Elvis and Ricky Nelson and Little Richard and Fats Domino, and I was exposed to all that music through her. My brother was more interested in folk music, and I got interested in the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul and Mary through him. My dad always encouraged me to golf, and actually I think he bought me a set of golf clubs, which my brother took, because I had one summer I didn't golf at all, and he took the clubs and he pawned them for a guitar. And I laid claim to that guitar, not that I could play it, but because it came from the fruit of my golf clubs. So, but my brother never learned to play it, but I, of course, learned to play it. In 6 weeks I could, play a lot of chords, and I was starting to learn to play a little bit of lead guitar.
What was the name of that guitar?
It was a Harmony Sovereign, and it was an acoustic guitar, an arch top. It was like a very cheap jazz guitar, but I didn't know any better, of course, as things progressed. And the guy who was the biggest influence on me, we used to go when we were in 7th and 8th grade, we used to go to this guy's basement where there was a band that practiced, and they had lots of couches and pillows, and we'd bring our girlfriends and we'd neck with our girlfriends while they played the same 3 or 4 tunes they could never actually get through. And the bass player in that band was a guy named Sam Friedman, and he was my locker partner in junior high school. And the band was getting nowhere, so Sam went out and he rented a guitar from a music store on the south side of Milwaukee. And in 2 weeks, he became a proficient lead guitar player. This is like a transformation that I'd never seen, especially as a 7th grader. I had no idea. So if I could go forward in the story, a couple weeks later, we're down there, we're necking with our girlfriends, and the band comes to rehearse. And he walks in the rehearsal and he says, he gets the band together and he says, "I am now the lead guitar player." And he looks at the lead guitar player and says, "You are now the rhythm guitar player." And he looks at the drummer, who's a friend of ours named Jeff Weicker, and he was playing a drum on a card table chair. That's all he had. He said, "You have 2 weeks to blackmail your parents into buying you a whole kit of drums, and if you can't get that accomplished, you're fired." And then he turned to me, and I'm in the middle of this big wet kiss with this big Polish girl, and he said, "Oh, by the way, Bob, you're going to be the bass player, and you're coming over to my house every day after school to learn how to play bass," which I did dutifully. And I was also put in the position I had to blackmail my parents to get a bass guitar. And I made a deal with my father, and I said, he wanted me, my father was a Presbyterian, and there was for people in junior high school, I think I was 13 or something, he said, if you go to this class that lasts 6 weeks and learn about the basics of the Bible, then I'll buy you this bass guitar if you graduate from this confirmation class in church. So I did it dutifully. He bought the bass, he kept his part of the bargain, and I was in a band. And it was a lot of fun. And I played bass in bands for about a year and a half. And then during that time, I bought a guitar, which is near and dear to our narrator here, Jim, and all my friends named it the Tone Master. And I don't know why, but it picked up its own name. It had its own vibe, and it had its own legend. It was like I had this thing. It was like a dog, and everybody would they'd call me up and say, "Well, hi Bob, how's the Tone Master doing today?" And this was the rapport we had when I was in high school. And I learned to play guitar on this, and so I was in bands all through high school. And at the end of high school, I started a band called The Ox with a guy named John Paris, and we became. Over the 5 years we played, we became a very successful band and did quite well. We opened for a tremendous number of national touring acts. Oh, I should rewind and talk about national touring acts. And so that was my first introduction really into professional playing, and it was a great schooling for both John and I because we had to learn to put a professional show together. We had to learn to pick proper tunes, we had to learn to sing harmony, we had to learn how to book gigs, we had to learn how to do all the mechanics of Band 101. You know, we learned Band 101 there, and we learned it really good. When I was in high school, Sam, my friend who taught me basically how to play guitar, took me to my first concert of a touring national band, and I got to see James Brown and the Famous Flames at the Milwaukee Arena sometime in 1963, when James Brown was really at the height of his powers. And it was really when he was doing R&B before he really invented now what was called soul music or funk music, because he's kind of considered the grandfather of that. And I saw him do his Please, 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 where he had a valet who would put a cape on him in this, and his band was unbelievably tight, and he was a great dancer, and it was really lovely to see. Another band I saw about at the same time was the first kind of citywide, well-known rock and roll band called the Del Reys, and these guys had all matching Fender guitars, and they had black Fender guitars with tortoiseshell pickguards, and I was so impressed. And they played at Atwater Beach in Shorewood at some sort of summer function that kids would go to. It was rock and roll, like a rock and roll teen hop dance, basically, and that really impressed me a lot. These guys had the lead player had a Stratocaster, the rhythm player had a Jazzmaster, which are Fender models, and the bass player had a Fender Jazz bass, but all the same custom color finish that had to be ordered from the factory this way. Very, very impressive for the young mind, you know.
Now, what year was that?
That was either 1963 or 1964, and that was the kind of citywide, really professional local band that I ever heard.
So that's pre-Beatles.
Pre-Beatles, and the repertoire reflected that, which was really pretty much a selection of rhythm and blues songs. You had people, they were doing Motown artist songs, and Chicago had a great rhythm and blues scene. Memphis, of course, had a great rhythm and blues scene. And there was, kids listened to WCFL and WOKY, which were local radio stations, but on a good night you could always get WSM, and you could get blacks, which was in Nashville, and you could get black stations from the South, and you could really hear it, because as we all know now, the black artists would originate this great body of music, and then usually white artists would cover it, like Pat Boone would cover Little Richard's Tutti Frutti, for example, and other white artists would cover this, and they would try to kind of market this more to white kids, but we couldn't be fooled. Once we heard the real thing, we knew what it was all about. And so that was great, and so I had a great Milwaukee experience with the Ox, and when that came to an end, I played in a band called the Hound Dog Band, which had a different direction, was more really like a country rock band, and I played in that band for 2.5 years. And after I finished playing in that band, I decided thought I was seasoned enough and ready for the big time, and I moved to Los Angeles, California in 1974, in January of 1974, and got immersed in a national scene, because as I was from Wisconsin, I also met many musicians from Kansas City. I met a lot of guys from Phoenix. I met a lot of guys from San Francisco. I met a lot of guys from Portland. I met a lot of guys from Alaska. I met a lot of guys from Boston, from Detroit. They all had little cliques in Los Angeles, and so it was really a national scene, and you really got to see where your talent lies with many, many, many musicians of all over the nation. And my first professional gig, I instantly dove into bands, and I was playing in what we would call now top 40 bands or cover bands. But my first national touring band was a band that they were more TV oriented. There was a band called the Hudson Brothers, and they were signed to Arista Records, which was at the time the head guy was Clive Davis, who I got to meet and work with. And they were also recording artists, but they were not only musicians who wrote songs, but they were comedians and had kind of almost like a TV comedic presence, and they did TV shows and stuff. But I toured with them for 2 years, and I met musicians, and I started the networking of professional musicians that we all know over our whole lifetime. The drummer I played with, Billy Thomas, has gone on to great professionalism. He played with Mac Davis, which was considered a very good gig in LA for quite a while, but lately he's been playing with Vince Gill and singing the high harmonies with Vince Gill. He and Vince are great singers together. And the keyboard player in that band was a guy named Eric Bakalis, and he got involved with a guy who wrote scores for TV shows, a guy named Mike Post, and he wrote the scores for like Hill Street Blues and Law and Order, and he works under him so he's writing scores for television. He's a very good keyboard player, and he's from Kansas City. And then after the Hudson Brothers, I played in an English band. I was the only American who played in this band. The guy's name was Ian Matthews, and he started out in a band called Fairport Convention, which was they were a band that was quite influential in folk and folk rock scenes in England, and there many, many great musicians came out of that band. Probably the most illustrious is Richard Thompson, and Ian came out of that band, and then he embarked on a solo career, and about midway through his solo career I was hired as a guitarist, and I was on tour with him to do a tour, and 5 weeks into the tour we had the number 4 record in the country. So I made a really great decision. It was just a lucky decision, but it did feel right. And then the next single I co-wrote with him, which was, of course, a boon to my career. And things progressed, and I played with him for 3 years, and we toured almost non-stop, and we made 3 records. And the musicians I met in that band I still know and play with to this day, and that are excellent, excellent, top quality, the best musicians in the world. And so that was a wonderful, wonderful experience. After that, I started playing with Don Mcclane, who was famous for a song called American Pie, and Don was a Hudson River troubadour, which meant that he was given some sort of stipend from, I think, the state of New York to travel up and down the Hudson, collect folk songs, entertain people, do little concerts, concerts on greens in the park. And he got proficient at that, and then wrote a lot of songs, and he was kind of catapulted into stardom with this song American Pie, which is a long song and kind of has an allegorical theme. I won't go into that, but it's worth checking out. It's worth checking out. When it was on the radio, I didn't really care for the song all that much, but once I got in the band and got to know Don and sang with him and played with him, I got to really, really enjoy the song and really enjoy Don. He was an unbelievably good singer, one of the best singers I've ever worked with, and as was Ian Matthews, by the way, too. And I played with Don for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and then after that I had kind of interspersed periods of playing in Los Angeles and playing, I would just say playing locally, doing sessions, playing some nightclubs, things like that, general music business stuff. And then in 1985 I did a long tour with Spencer Davis, which was very successful, and another great bunch of guys I've known again my whole life. I got one of the Ian Matthews people involved, the bass player, got him involved in that, and he was a huge hit with that bunch, and he and I are still very good friends. I was in Ireland, I just saw him this last summer, and that was a wonderful, we were in Germany for about 5 weeks, and then, actually we started out in the US, we played in the US for about a month, and then we had an opportunity to go to Germany, which we did. We played there for about 5 weeks, and the band really coalesced and gelled, and we had a very, very, very good band, one of the better bands I've been in. And then we came back and we played the US for about another month, and when we were hired, we were told was going to be a 1-month tour, turned into about a 3 or 4 month tour, and it was really a lot of fun. We had a great time. One of the high points was in New York there was a famous club called the Lone Star on 12th and 5th in New York City that had this giant iguana lizard on the roof, and Spencer Davis was booked, and when we got there and we played, and we were playing our first set, we noticed everybody in the audience seemed to have a black leather jacket and something underneath it, and we thought, this is really weird. So we went and had our break, and then came down for our second show, and we're on the very first song we're playing, out of nowhere catapults on stage Stevie Winwood, Stevie Winwood was an original member with the Spencer Davis group. And as the story goes, Stevie Winwood and Spencer Davis never played in the United States together, ever. Stevie Winwood had left that band to start this band called Traffic that was very famous in England before they'd made their first US tour. So they'd only really played in England and Europe. And so here he is, he jumps on stage, and all these people, the black leather jackets open up, and of course it's the paparazzi, and a million flash bulbs go off. And there was nothing that week except Stevie Winwood playing with Spencer Davis on MTV the whole week. It was in all the press, it was really a big deal. And Stevie played keyboards, as he does. He played guitar, he played bass, he played drums, he sang, of course. He was a pleasure to be around. He's a great musician, and he's a lovely cat. It was the high point of that tour for me, I thought, to meet and play with Stevie Winwood. It was very great. And after that tour, I again played on more sessions and played locally in Los Angeles. And then in 1988, I was hired to play with Leonard Cohen. I auditioned, and there were quite a few illustrious musicians who tried out for that gig, and I was lucky enough to be hired. And I did a world tour with him in 1988, and then I in support of the record he'd already recorded, I was hired for that. And then I played on his next record and did his next tour. And then when that tour was done, I produced his live record. My wife and I co-produced it, and that consisted of 24-track recordings from the 1988 tour and the 1992 tour, and we worked on that record for about 3 months, and it's a live record. It's very good. It's a platinum selling record. It's very successful, and it's a great way to freeze him in time and the same band that he had for these two tours in 1988 and 1992, and that was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Leonard is a fantastic person and a great musician and a super songwriter, and I really enjoyed those tours a lot. In the 90s, I did an awful lot of studio work, and I did a lot of producing, and I also played locally an awful lot. It was a very busy decade for me. I had a really great local band, one of the best bands I've ever been in, and we played for about 5 years, and the band was called Best of the West, and everybody in the band was spectacular at what they did, and I really loved that band, and we unfortunately did not stick together or make any records or anything, but we played an awful lot of gigs, and it was a very, very good band. Every time I'm in Los Angeles, we always have a little reunion, and we go play a gig somewhere, and we have a great time. In 2003, I did a tour of Japan with a guy named Kevin Banford, and which was a lot of fun, and I met some great musicians. One of the guys I met was Ted Camp, who's the bass player for a guy named Shooter Jennings, who's Waylon Jennings' son, and they have kind of an alt-country, really more of a rock band, but they might be called alt-country. But Ted is a fabulous New York musician, and he and I have become very good friends. I met him in 2003 on a tour I did. And then I hadn't really toured. I moved to Boston in 2004. My wife teaches at Berklee College of Music. She's a professor there. And I've been playing locally in Boston. I go down to New York and do records from time to time. In 2007, Leonard Cohen called me and we said, would you please come join my band? We want to do a tour. And I did a 3-year tour with Leonard Cohen, encompassing the years 2008, 2009, 2010. And we went everywhere in the world. We played over 250 concerts, and we played for probably 5 to 7 million people. And it was very, very successful, and it was a lot of fun. And very, very good. And I've been playing in Boston locally lately, and now I'm in Milwaukee to do a 40-year reunion of my band, The Ox, and my other band, the Hound Dog Band. And that brings me up to current times.
Well, how does your roots in Milwaukee prepare you for this kind of a sort of an international touring and recording and producing career? Like, what did you take from your days in Milwaukee?
Well, Milwaukee musicians, when I got to Los Angeles finally, I learned that Milwaukee musicians were a little more qualified due to the fact that we played so many gigs. There were a lot of places to play, and I was in popular bands that played all the time. I played between 20 and 25 times a month, 250 gigs a year for way over 20 years. So just from the amount of hours that I put in, I was very qualified. And one thing I learned in Los Angeles is there's all kinds of musicians. There's people who are what we call great written musicians, like arrangers I had a very good friend in Los Angeles who was a tremendous arranger, and he was a copyist, and he wrote beautiful sheet music and great charts, but he wrote beautiful arrangements for recordings. And I remember calling him up and saying, you got a bass, right? Why don't you come on and play this gig with me? We need a bass player tonight. And he was not a very good bass player, but he was a great musician, and he was an astute musician, but his talent was not in performance. So what I learned, and what Milwaukee has, is people who come from here are strong in the performance arts. They're strong performers. There are all kinds of musicians, all kinds of ways to be successful in music, but performance is one thing that prepares you to tour and doesn't prepare you to be a good recording musician. The most I learned about recording was playing with people in England. They know much more about how to make records or they're much more maybe sharing of their techniques on how to make records than I've learned from people in the United States. It's a little harder coming up here as a recording musician, but in England I had a mentor who really helped me a lot, and I became a very good session player. In fact, I think that's one of the things I do the best is play on records, because I know how to play succinctly, and I know that playing on a record is different than going out and playing a gig. It's a different talent.
Of all the musicians you played with in Milwaukee, who do you think are the, like the all-stars? Who's the all-star band?
Well, of the ones I played with, I think at the time, really, I mean, my first high school band, I played with Jerry Harrison, who went on to play in the Talking Heads, and he was also in Jonathan Richman's band, which was called the Modern Lovers, which was successful, but not quite to the worldwide success of the Talking Heads. Jerry was not the best player in high school, but I guess we'd have to qualify him as a late bloomer. But I played with him today, and he's a very good player. And Jerry's a very smart player, an intelligent player. Obviously, John Paris, who I've had a lifelong association with, is a great musician. You know, he's a together guy, and he knows what he's doing. And he's a good music. He's good at all facets of music. He's very well rounded, very good singer, very good harp player. Some of the musicians I played with have not pursued careers, and they've kind of dropped out over time, and so some of their skills have deteriorated. Mark Sychek was always one of the best bass players I knew, and I've been playing with him in the Hound Dog Band for this reunion. He's a very good bass player, and he played professionally in Los Angeles for quite a few years. He's not playing professionally right now, though. Freddie Bluford is a guy I knew from high school. We never really played too much together, but we were in a band for about maybe a year or a year and a half. And Freddie is an R&B singer type, and he has a tremendous amount of energy, and he knows how to interpret rhythm and blues songs and put them over properly. He's very good. He's part of our reunion as well, and I'm looking forward to playing with him again. And it's nice to see him. We've been rehearsing the last few days. It's nice to see him. He's even though he doesn't really play professionally anymore, but he's very, very professional. Very, very good. Top quality, really.
Now, we've heard stories from other people we've talked to today about the house on Kane Street and the community that developed there.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was, I mean, it happened just by arbitrarily. How it started was I had a bunch of friends that were high school friends. I went to Shorewood High School in Milwaukee, which was the public high school, but I had an awful lot of friends who went to Dominican High School, which was in Whitefish Bay, but it was nearby, and these were my Catholic friends that were all kind of grew up in the same part of town that I did, and they had an apartment they rented, and there was this old Polish woman named Mrs. Meister, and they had an apartment, and they had roommates. I think there were 3 or 4 of them, and one of them had to give up the residence for the summer, and I was asked if I could, wanted to come and live there for the summer, and I said of course I would. So I lived there with Kurt and a couple other guys, and my friend Kurt Neuenfeld, and then while I was living there, it appeared that Mrs. Meister passed away, and the estate passed on, and a property manager was put in place, and it just so turned out a couple of friends of mine became the on-site managers of the building, and they were in charge of renting the places. And my friend Bob Dickey and myself rented the basement apartment, which had a kind of provenance because it was previously occupied by this very famous folk musician who also owned the Avant-Garde Coffee House. So it was kind of imbued with a beautiful vibe, and we jumped at the chance of living in the basement, even with all the heating pipes, And
Short Stuff was born in that apartment.
And Short Stuff was born. A very famous local Milwaukee band was born rehearsing in that apartment. And we lived there for many, many years, it seemed to me. So these people who also, I think Tom Hayes went to Dominican High School, Marquette, and Mary Kay went to,
I don't know if she went to Dominican or went to...
But she was a neighbor of mine. She lived 1 block away from me. But she was Catholic, and so they went to Catholic schools. And I was a public school kid. But these were friends of ours in our social circle. So they rented only, when apartments came available, they only rented to other friends. So it turned out, of a building that had 21 apartments, eventually 19 of them were people I was very, very well acquainted with, and either were friends or very, very well acquainted with. And so we had, you can imagine, if you live in a place where all your friends are are occupying 19 of the 21 apartments, there must have been just a few really good parties. And boy, did we had a good time. It seemed for about 1 year, I never left that place unless I was playing a gig. And that was Party Central. And it was just a beautiful place. John Paris, my associate from the from the Ox, lived in an apartment there. Mark Sychek lived in an apartment there. My good friend Tim Maher, who's a college friend of mine, lived in an apartment there. So it was great. It was just a beautiful place to live, and it was one of these moments in times that never will be recreated again, and where all the forces came together and created a beautiful, beautiful situation for us.
So how many bands were living there?
I would say at least 3 or 4 bands. And we were all very friendly with each other. The competition was at a real minimum, I would say.
Did you all have to load out at the same times?
There were 2 entrances, and we had storage lockers for equipment. I mean, it was an ideal place. It was just ideal. I remember living there when I first moved in and was living upstairs with Kurt Neuenfeld. I remember looking out the window, and I watched Lou Alcindor jogging around the park in his UCLA warm-up. Now, Lou Alcindor became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar because he took a Muslim name, but he was Lou Alcindor in college and went to UCLA and was drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks, the basketball team in Milwaukee. And this was my neighbor, and this guy's a very, very famous basketball player. I thought that was just so fantastic. And we lived on a bluff right over the lakefront. It was really ideal, a really great place to live. Now it's a parking lot, unfortunately.
Tell us about this reunion this week.
About the reunion? Well, Bob Dickey and Mike Kappas, who were instrumental in the careers of both the Hound Dog Band and Ox in a booking capacity, got together and said, let's have a reunion. Now Mike has an agency in San Francisco called the Rosebud Agency that's a famous agency, and he deals with the Summerfest booking, Summerfest being a very large Milwaukee festival, and was able to secure a night for us at Summerfest and made it all possible for us to put this whole reunion together. We decided to add an extra gig for fun at Shank Hall, which is a local nightclub, and due to contractual obligations, we're calling it the East Side All-Stars, and we're named the gig the Last Polka. And we expanded it to have Jerry Harrison involved from the Talking Heads, and a band called Dynamite Duck, which was another one of our friendly musical brethren that had a band and that were very good. And so we're having a huge night of music. We're starting at 8 and we'll go to 1:30, and it's all friends from a certain era that we're all reuniting, and it's our reunion weekend, really. It's going to be a great time.
Okay. For a young musician who's getting started and looking for some direction or guidance, what would you tell them?
Learn your instrument completely. Don't just think about, oh, I just want to learn this song so I can get on American Idol. I think today's musicians, what I find is there's a little bit of instant gratification going on. They don't dig deep enough, they don't study their instrument enough. I think you cannot be over-prepared. If you want a career in music, if you want to be a professional, you have to learn to read music. You have to learn to read charts. You have to learn to play all types. You can't just... We all come up in one type of music. When I started, it was blues. I love the blues. I can play blues now, but I play all sorts of varieties of music, all sorts. And you have to learn to play everything. And you have to get a good education in music if you want to be a lifer, do it for a career.
Is there anything else you'd like to just add before we wrap it up?
No, there's nothing really I could say. I think this project is worthwhile, and I hope everybody enjoys hearing all the stories from the people.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
Okay.